I woke up in the hospital, the fluorescent lights blinding as I blinked myself back into consciousness. The dull, constant beep of machines and the sterile smell surrounding me made it hard to remember where I was or how I got here. My head throbbed as I tried to piece it all together. The last thing I remembered was Sophie, my young wife, sitting across from me in our kitchen, casually suggesting we spice things up with an open marriage. My stomach twisted just thinking about it. At first, I thought it was a joke. Sophie's face had been so serene, so nonchalant, as if she'd merely suggested a change in the dinner menu, not the boundaries of our marriage. Her words echoed in my mind, cutting through the fog. "Jack, don't you think things have gotten a bit routine?" Routine? Our life together wasn't perfect, but I thought we had something solid. We'd only been married a few years, and while I was a few years older than her, I never imagined she'd find me boring or lacking in any way. I didn't see it coming, her sitting there, laying out the proposition as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world. You know, just a bit of freedom for both of us. To explore. The memory burned. I'd felt a mix of betrayal, shock, and rage, yet there was something else, an odd sense of disbelief. I tried to ignore it, to think she might drop the idea, but Sophie only became more insistent. Her tone was patient, but the resolve in her eyes was terrifying. And then came the part that I still couldn't shake. "I love you, Jack. I just think this could be something exciting." Was I really that naive? I had let her push, hoping it was just a phase. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, the idea turned into a proposal, then practically an ultimatum. When I told her how I felt, she accused me of being closed-minded, of not wanting her to live fully. I remembered the tension rising, the arguments escalating. It was the night before that things finally blew up. She'd told me she was going out with friends, something that had become all too frequent. I tried to confront her about it, about the changes I was seeing, about how distant she'd become. She turned to me with a cold, calculated look. "Jack, I told you. This is how it's going to be. Take it or leave it." The words were like a slap, but I held back, watching her leave. And then, hours later, the dread of not knowing where she was finally drove me to get in the car and search for her, desperate and hurt beyond words. I barely remember what happened next. Just the blinding headlights, the screeching tires, and then, nothing. Back in the hospital room, I could hear a faint voice calling my name. I turned my head, and there she was, Sophie, looking beautiful as ever but with a hollow expression, as if this inconvenience of me lying here was somehow ruining her evening. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect. For a second, I thought she might genuinely care, but the look faded as she stood there silently. "Jack," she finally said, her voice lacking warmth. "How are you feeling?" I didn't respond immediately. My mind spun with everything that had happened, the accident, and now seeing her here, all calm and poised. I felt like a stranger in my own life, lying there in that bed while my wife looked at me like a passing obligation. "They said you'd be fine," she continued. "Just a bit shaken up." Her tone was oddly detached, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was here out of duty, or if there was any real concern behind those eyes. I stared at her, taking in every detail, every hint of distance between us. "Why, Sophie?" My voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but I had to ask. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Why what, Jack? Why would you want to do this to us? To everything we built together?" Her smile was fleeting, barely there. "Jack, this is a new world. People don't just settle down and tie themselves to one person anymore. I'm young, and I want to experience things. You can't expect me to live in this box forever." Each word was like a twist of the knife. I thought I knew her, thought we shared the same dreams. And now here I was, realizing that the life we'd built was only a stepping stone for her next thrill. She moved closer, taking a seat beside me, her hand lightly touching mine. It felt hollow, as if she were just going through the motions. "I'm here, Jack. But I need you to understand, this isn't about you. It's about me." About us growing, exploring. I pulled my hand away, the pain of her touch unbearable. Growing? Is that what you call it? By throwing away everything we have? She let out a sigh, that same patronizing patience she'd shown me before. Jack, I thought you'd understand by now. I thought you'd come around. It doesn't have to change anything between us. My head spun with her words, the absurdity of it all. She was trying to keep me in her life, yet she wanted this freedom to indulge in whatever she fancied. A harsh reality began to sink in, one I'd been too blind to see until now. Sophie didn't want a marriage. She wanted a free pass, an open door to walk through as she pleased. Sophie, I said, my voice thick with betrayal, I can't do this. I thought we had something real. You can't just throw this all away. She stood up, brushing off her dress with a casual air. If that's how you feel, Jack, then maybe it's best if we both move on. There it was, laid out before me, raw and unforgiving. I'd thought waking up in that hospital bed was the worst part of this nightmare, but it wasn't. It was realizing that my marriage, my love, was as fragile as glass in Sophie's hands, shattered without a second thought. She walked toward the door without looking back, her heels clicking against the floor, the sound haunting in its finality. The door shut, leaving me alone in the silence of the hospital room, with only the beeping of the heart monitor as a reminder that I was still alive, still breathing. But my heart felt empty, hollowed out by the woman I thought I knew, the woman who walked away from me as if I were nothing more than a chapter in her story, one she'd already closed. The following days passed in a haze of loneliness and resentment, seeping into every part of my life. Sophie's words echoed in my head like a broken record. Her casual dismissal of our marriage, the way she'd walked out of that hospital room without even looking back, haunted me. When I finally returned home, the house felt different, stripped of warmth. Our shared spaces, the living room, the kitchen, our bedroom, were just empty shells of what they used to be. I would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone, waiting for a message that never came. She hadn't bothered to check in, hadn't even left a note. I wanted to believe she'd come back, that this was all a mistake. But each silent day that passed was a reminder of how distant she had become. I felt myself slipping into a dark place. Each night was an endless cycle of replaying her words, over and over. At first, I hated the idea of an open marriage. It seemed like a ridiculous demand, an insult to everything we'd promised each other. But then, somewhere in the bleak loneliness, something shifted. As much as I hated to admit it, Sophie's proposal stayed in my mind, a thorn that wouldn't go away. Was this emptiness she felt really so bad that it drove her to want something more? I began to wonder if maybe I'd been wrong to resist. Maybe I had been holding her back, locking her into a life that was too small, too predictable. The more I thought about it, the more I began to wonder if this open marriage idea might somehow bring her back to me. Maybe this was her way of showing me a different side of herself, something I hadn't been willing to see. After days of agonizing over it, I finally made up my mind. I would give it a try, just to see if it could somehow save what we had. I was out of options, desperate enough to try anything that might bring her back. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her completely, of our life ending this way. That evening, I called her, my hands shaking as I pressed her number. She picked up on the second ring, her tone cool, distant, as if she'd been expecting the call but didn't particularly care about it. "What's up, Jack?" she asked, as if nothing was wrong. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "I've been thinking about what you said. About an open marriage." The silence on the other end was chilling. I imagined her sitting there, her expression unreadable as she absorbed what I was saying. "Go on," she finally replied, her voice barely masking a hint of intrigue. I hesitated, feeling like I was betraying myself, like I was giving up a part of my soul. "I don't want to lose you, Sophie. If this is what you need, maybe I should try to understand it." She was quiet for a moment, and I could practically feel the satisfaction radiating through the phone. "I think that's wise, Jack. This could be good for us. I'm glad you're open to it." something about the way she said that made my stomach twist. I couldn't tell if she was genuinely pleased or if she was just relieved to have my compliance. We agreed to meet at a cafe near our house to talk it over. I hadn't seen her since the hospital, and I had no idea what to expect. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a table by the window, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the lights. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was a new air about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She seemed relaxed, almost energized in a way that stung to see. "Jack," she greeted me with a smile that felt painfully formal. "I'm glad you came." I nodded, feeling awkward as I sat down across from her. I couldn't believe we were actually here, talking about something so far from what I'd imagined for us. But there was no turning back now. She laid it all out in a clear, methodical way, as if she'd thought about this long before she'd ever brought it up to me. She explained her vision of an open marriage. We would be free to see other people, but we would be honest with each other, setting boundaries that would protect our relationship. She even brought a list of ground rules she'd written out in her neat handwriting, as though this was a business arrangement and not the destruction of everything I thought I knew. She talked about how exciting it would be to explore new experiences, how it could reinvigorate our bond, make us more open and connected as a couple. I sat there, listening in stunned silence, trying to find any hint of hesitation or doubt in her eyes. But there was none. She was fully committed to this path, and it was clear that my resistance wouldn't change her mind. "Jack," she said, reaching out to place her hand on mine, "I need this. I think you'll find it freeing too." Her touch, once comforting, now felt foreign, cold. But I was desperate to hold on to her, even if it meant sacrificing my own pride, my own ideals. "What if this doesn't work, Sophie?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What if it just tears us apart?" She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "It's a risk, sure. But maybe it's a risk we need to take. Don't you want to see what else is out there, Jack?" Her question lingered in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. What else was out there? I wasn't interested in anyone else, I just wanted her. But maybe this was the only way to keep her in my life. After an agonizing pause, I nodded. "All right, Sophie. Let's give it a try." A strange relief washed over her face, like a weight had been lifted. She gave my hand a gentle squeeze, a gesture that felt both comforting and hollow. "Thank you, Jack. You won't regret this." But even as she said it, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. There was something in her eyes, a spark of excitement that felt more like a goodbye than a new beginning. The first few weeks were surreal. We continued with our routines, but there was an unspoken tension between us. Sophie seemed lighter, more carefree. She'd started dressing up more, going out late. I told myself I'd do the same, that I'd try to embrace this freedom she spoke of. But each night I'd find myself at home, alone, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't freedom at all. One night, Sophie came home late, her eyes gleaming, cheeks flushed. She didn't bother to explain where she'd been or who she'd been with, and I didn't ask. I knew the answer would only break me further. "Good night, Jack," she said, her tone light, as if nothing were amiss. I couldn't bear it any longer. "Sophie, is this really what you want? Is this enough for you?" She paused, looking back at me with a strange mixture of pity and exasperation. "It's not just about what I want, Jack. It's about us growing, remember?" With that, she turned and left me standing there, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt. As I lay in bed that night, the emptiness pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I realized that this wasn't a new beginning, it was the end of everything I'd ever known. The realization that Sophie was out there with someone else, laughing, sharing moments that used to be ours, burned a hole in my chest. Each time I pictured her in the arms of another man, something dark and furious stirred within me. The pain was unbearable, twisting itself into anger that clawed its way to the surface. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and desperate for some way to make her feel even a fraction of what I was going through. She wanted freedom? Fine. But I wasn't going to be the only one hurting in this arrangement. At first, I tried to ignore the rage, to push it down and focus on rebuilding myself. I told myself I could accept this open marriage for what it was, that I would find my own distractions to take my mind off her betrayal. But each time I saw her, carefree and glowing in a way she hadn't been around me for months, it fueled my resolve. She'd taken something precious from me, and I wanted her to know what that felt like. Revenge became my lifeline. Late one night, while Sophie was out again, this time she didn't even bother with an excuse, I decided it was time. If she was so determined to find excitement and adventure without me, then maybe I could find someone who'd appreciate what I had to offer. Someone who'd make her see what she was risking, what she'd thrown away. I went to the bedroom, dug out a suit I hadn't worn in ages, and polished my shoes, feeling an unfamiliar thrill rise in me. I looked at myself in the mirror. The tired man staring back had been cast aside, left to rot while Sophie went on her explorations. Tonight, I was going to show her that I could move on, too, that she didn't have the monopoly on new experiences. I walked out of the house, feeling a strange mix of guilt and exhilaration. This wasn't me, but maybe that was the point. Maybe I needed to let go of the me she'd abandoned. I ended up at a bar downtown, one of those places we used to go when we were first dating. I felt out of place at first, but the atmosphere slowly got to me, the music, the people, the low lights. I took a seat at the bar and ordered a drink, trying to shake off the nerves. Part of me couldn't believe I was actually doing this. But another part, the part that had been broken and abandoned by the woman I loved, wanted nothing more than to go through with it. That's when I saw her. She was sitting alone at a table near the back, sipping a glass of wine and scanning the room with an air of quiet confidence. She wasn't dressed provocatively or even particularly flashy, but there was something captivating about her, something magnetic. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, I forgot about Sophie and the pain she'd caused. I saw only this woman, her dark eyes watching me with a curious intensity. I walked over, heart pounding, and introduced myself. Her name was Emma. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing on her part. She simply smiled and invited me to sit. The conversation flowed easily, and I felt a weight lift, a strange freedom I hadn't expected. Emma was sharp, funny, and there was something in her gaze that made me feel seen, even valued. For the first time in months, I laughed. We talked about everything and nothing, and I felt myself relax, the bitterness and anger melting away, if only for a moment. When she touched my arm, a casual brush that lingered just a second too long, it sent a thrill through me, and I remembered what it felt like to be desired, to be wanted. Emma didn't ask about my situation, didn't pry into the story behind my quiet sadness, but there was an unspoken understanding between us, a silent agreement that tonight, we both needed something from each other. I couldn't help but think of Sophie, out with some stranger, likely sharing the same kind of intimacy I was about to. The thought made my pulse quicken, but this time, it was for a different reason. When Emma leaned in, her breath warm against my neck, I didn't pull away. I let myself get lost in the moment, in the feeling of her lips on mine, her hands tracing along my shoulders. All the anger, the sadness, the frustration, it all seemed to pour out in that embrace. For the first time, I felt as if I were reclaiming a piece of myself, taking back the power I'd let Sophie strip from me. The night passed in a blur, one drink leading to another, and before I knew it, I was leaving the bar with Emma, our arms linked as we walked through the quiet streets. We ended up back at her place, a small, cozy apartment filled with books and paintings. She poured us another drink, and we sat together on her couch, talking in low voices that faded into comfortable silence. When the morning light crept through the curtains, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and guilt. Emma was still asleep beside me, her hand resting gently on my arm. I watched her for a moment, feeling a pang of remorse. This wasn't her fault, she didn't deserve to be part of my revenge, my twisted game to make Sophie feel the hurt she'd caused me. But as I lay there, the guilt gave way to something else, a sense of control, of purpose. I left Emma's apartment quietly, leaving a note thanking her for the night, and I headed home. The drive was a whirlwind of emotions, the excitement slowly fading as reality settled back in. I wasn't sure what I'd say to Sophie, or if I'd even tell her at all. Part of me wanted her to know, to see the pain she'd pushed me to, but another part of me feared that it wouldn't matter, that she'd already moved on in ways I couldn't understand. When I got home, Sophie was there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I walked in, offering only a casual morning, as if I'd been out grabbing coffee and not spending the night with another woman. I sat down across from her, watching her, trying to gauge any hint of jealousy, of remorse. But there was nothing. She just looked up, smiling in a way that seemed almost approving, as if she'd expected this outcome all along. "So, you had a good night?" she asked, her tone light, almost teasing. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to see her reaction, to see if there was any trace of the Sophie I once knew, the woman who'd cared deeply about our life together. "Yeah," I replied finally, my voice low. "I did." She nodded, her expression unfazed, as if my confession didn't sting her in the slightest. I felt a surge of anger, of frustration. She wasn't going to react, wasn't going to care. "Did you want me to ask for details, Jack?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "I told you, this is what we agreed on. Freedom." Her words hung in the air, and I realized then how far gone she really was. The woman I'd loved, the life we'd built, it was all slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I got up and walked away, leaving her there, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I'd lost. The revenge I'd sought, the brief satisfaction, it was hollow. Sophie had moved on, and in her eyes, I had too. In that moment, I understood that this was the beginning of the end, a chapter closing with a finality I wasn't ready to face. And as I stood alone in the quiet of our empty bedroom, I realized that maybe the hardest part of all was accepting that the woman I'd loved was already gone, a ghost lingering in the life we used to share. The more I thought about Sophie's indifference, the more determined I became. If she could breeze through life while tearing ours apart, then she wasn't going to get off so easily. I would make her feel the sting of betrayal, of jealousy, the unease of wondering what I was up to. I wanted her to question, to feel the anxiety she'd so casually inflicted on me. She wanted a game? Fine. I'd play along, but this time, I'd make sure she felt every twist and turn. My plan started small, subtle. I began working later than usual, making a point to leave the house at odd hours. I'd started at a new gym, somewhere she wouldn't know anyone, a place where I could slip off her radar and build up some mystery. I'd come home showered and fresh, acting casual, but I could tell my behavior was getting under her skin. Sophie wasn't one to pry, but I could see her curiosity growing. A few times, she asked about my new routine, and I would brush her off with vague replies, carefully crafted to keep her wondering. "Just a project at work," I'd say, or "I've been meeting new people." Each vague answer seemed to plant a seed of doubt, and I could see her mask slipping, her easy confidence waning as the days passed. To keep her guessing, I started coming home late at night, texting her that I was out with friends, or had met someone interesting. I'd go quiet for hours, leaving her wondering where I was, who I was with, and what I might be doing. I knew Sophie wasn't used to feeling uncertain or out of control, and each time she saw me walk in, she looked a little more unsettled, her eyes darting over me as if she might catch a trace of lipstick or perfume. Then, I decided to take it up a notch. I developed a casual acquaintance with Emma after our first night together, and I reached out to her, explaining that I was going through something difficult and might need a friend to lean on. Emma was empathetic and supportive, not prying into the details but genuinely caring. When I suggested getting dinner a few nights a week, she was more than willing, and our friendship started to grow. One Friday, I decided to put my plan into full effect. I'd told Sophie I was going out to dinner with friends, but I knew she'd be curious enough to check up on me. I asked Emma to meet me at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place Sophie and I used to frequent. As I arrived, I could feel a rush of excitement and nerves, knowing Sophie might very well be watching. Emma greeted me warmly, and we laughed over drinks, sharing stories and catching up like old friends. I watched the entrance, half expecting Sophie to walk in, and after about 30 minutes, there she was. She hadn't seen me yet, but her eyes were scanning the room, lingering on each table as she searched. The thrill of her attention, of watching her face tighten as she realized I was actually here with another woman, was exactly what I'd hoped for. She finally spotted me, her eyes locking onto mine with a flash of anger, jealousy, and confusion all mixed together. I turned back to Emma, pretending not to notice Sophie's gaze, and let her watch me laugh and smile. Every move, every word, was deliberate, designed to keep Sophie guessing, to make her feel like she was the one on the outside. As the night went on, Sophie stayed at the bar, her eyes glued to our table. She didn't approach, didn't make a scene, but I could feel the tension radiating from her, her fingers clenched around her glass. It was a victory like nothing I'd felt before, knowing that she was finally experiencing even a fraction of the jealousy and anxiety she'd put me through. When I returned home that night, Sophie was waiting, her expression cold and unreadable. I gave her a casual nod, acting as if the evening had been just another night out. "Did you have a nice time?" she asked, her voice a touch too even. "Yeah, it was a good night. Nice to get out, you know?" I replied, keeping my tone light, but I could see her mask cracking, the frustration and unease surfacing beneath her calm exterior. She crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "With anyone I know?" I shrugged, playing it off with a nonchalant smile. "Just some new friends I've made." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see her struggling to keep her cool. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, the doubts and insecurities building with each evasive answer. But she wouldn't confront me outright, not yet. She wanted to appear unaffected, as if she was above feeling jealous or insecure. But her silence only confirmed what I'd hoped, my plan was working. The next few weeks, I kept up the game, throwing in little details here and there, always vague enough to make her question. I'd leave out my phone, showing an occasional message notification from Emma, watching Sophie's eyes flicker with curiosity whenever she saw the name. I'd casually mention plans to go out, leaving the details just murky enough to keep her wondering. Each time, she tried to play it cool, but I could see the tension building, her grip tightening around her coffee mug, her smile strained and forced. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave, she finally broke. "So, who's this new friend of yours?" she asked, her voice laced with barely concealed jealousy. I turned to her, feigning surprise. "Oh, just someone I met recently. We've got a lot in common." She raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing. "You know, it's funny. You never mentioned her before." I shrugged, giving her a casual smile. "Guess I didn't think it was important." "You did say we could see other people, right?" That hit home. I could see her struggle to maintain her composure, the flash of anger crossing her face as she realized I'd used her own words against her. For a moment, I thought she might finally let her guard down, finally show me how much this was tearing her apart. But instead, she forced a strained smile, her voice tight. "Yes, of course," she replied, though her eyes betrayed her emotions. "I'm glad you're enjoying yourself." I left that night feeling a strange satisfaction, knowing I'd finally gotten under her skin. Each time I went out, each mention of Emma, each unexplained late night, only fueled her jealousy. I could see the cracks in her confidence, the uncertainty that she tried to hide behind her cool demeanor. It wasn't enough to erase the pain she'd caused me, but it was a start, a small victory in a battle she thought she'd already won. But as the days went on, I found myself wondering if this revenge, this elaborate game, was really what I wanted. It had given me satisfaction, yes, but it hadn't filled the emptiness. Sophie was still a stranger to me, our marriage a hollow shell. I had only managed to match her hurt, but it hadn't brought us any closer, hadn't healed the wounds she'd inflicted. One night, after another tense silence between us, I realized that I was no longer the man I had been before all this. Sophie had changed me, dragged me into a game I never wanted to play, and I had let her. And for what? A moment of satisfaction? A fleeting sense of control? I looked at her, this woman who had once been my whole world, and saw only a stranger. The thrill of revenge faded, leaving only a bitter taste, a hollow ache. It was then I realized that no amount of games, no clever tricks or manipulations, would ever bring back what we'd lost. Sophie had burned our life together to the ground, and I was only dancing in the ashes. With a deep sigh, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there in the silence, a silence that now stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. And for the first time, I began to see a way forward, a way out of the wreckage of our broken marriage. I could barely believe the words as I said them, but they came out clear and strong. "We're breaking up, Sophie. This isn't working. I'm going to see Emma." Her face went pale, the shock finally shattering the veneer of calm she'd clung to throughout all of this. For a moment, there was only silence, a stunned quiet between us as she stared at me, eyes widening in disbelief. Then her bottom lip trembled, her eyes filling with tears, and she began to cry. I had never seen her like this, not once in all our years together. She had always been so composed, so controlled. But now, as she choked back a sob, she looked raw, vulnerable, a stranger who was suddenly realizing the weight of everything she'd thrown away. "No, no, Jack, please," she whispered, her voice breaking as she tried to reach for me. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought we could find a way to make it work." I stepped back, feeling a strange mixture of anger and sorrow. Her tears stirred something in me, a shadow of the love we'd once shared, but it was buried too deep beneath the betrayal, the bitterness, the endless cycle of lies. I'd fought for us, struggled to hold on to something real, but she had pushed me past the point of no return. "Sophie, you made your choice," I replied, my voice steady but edged with the hurt I'd carried for so long. "You told me you wanted freedom, excitement. I tried to give you that, to understand, but all it did was tear us apart. You don't get to play the victim now." She shook her head, wiping at her eyes, but the tears kept coming, her sobs breaking through in ragged gasps. I didn't think you'd actually leave me. I thought we could. I thought I'd still have you. I was so stupid." Her words twisted in me, a pang of regret flickering in the anger. I had loved her once, loved her deeply, but this woman crying before me was a stranger. The Sophie I had loved, the one who had shared my dreams, my life, seemed to have disappeared the moment she'd opened that door to her freedom. "What did you expect, Sophie?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you think I'd just sit here, waiting for you while you played around with whoever you wanted? Did you really believe that I'd be fine with that?" She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the sobs racked her. "I was wrong, Jack," she choked out. I was selfish, and I thought I could handle it. But I can't. Not like this." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You can't handle it?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Do you have any idea what you put me through? The sleepless nights, the anxiety, the endless wondering who you were with, what you were doing? I went along with it for you, Sophie. I went along with it because I loved you. And you tore me apart." Her hands dropped from her face, her tear-streaked eyes searching mine with desperation. "I know, Jack. I know I did. And I hate myself for it. I thought I needed something more, something exciting. But it was you all along. I didn't see it until now." She reached for my hand, her fingers trembling as she touched mine, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a twinge of the connection we once had. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. She had opened a door that could never be closed again. "Sophie, I don't think I can do this anymore," I said softly, pulling my hand away. "I tried. God knows I tried. But every time I look at you, I remember the lies, the nights you spent with someone else. The way you acted like none of it mattered. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that." Her face crumpled, and she let out a broken sob, her shoulders slumping as she clutched at herself. "Please, Jack," she whispered. "Please. I'll do anything. I'll stop seeing anyone else. I'll go back to how it was. I don't want to lose you. But the words rang hollow, empty promises made too late. How many times had I waited for her to come to her senses, to see what she was destroying? How many times had I hoped that she'd wake up from whatever fantasy she'd conjured up and remember the life we'd built? But that hope had died, worn away by every selfish decision, every empty promise. I can't trust you, Sophie, I replied, my voice firm. I don't think I ever will again. You broke that trust, and you can't just glue it back together with tears and apologies. She flinched, as if I'd struck her, and I almost hated myself for the way her hurt mirrored my own. But this was the reality she had created, a nightmare that she dragged me into. I had fought for us, given her every chance to prove that we mattered, that we still had something worth saving. But in the end, she had chosen herself, her own desires, over everything we'd shared. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay strong, even as my own emotions surged beneath the surface. I need to move on, Sophie, I said, my voice steady. I need to be with someone who values what we have, someone who wouldn't throw it away for a cheap thrill. I deserve better than this. She broke down completely, collapsing onto the couch, her sobs filling the room. I watched her, feeling a strange detachment, as if I were observing someone else's life. The woman who had once been my everything was now just a memory, a shadow of what she could have been. As she cried, I felt a sense of finality settle over me, a calm resolve that replaced the anger, the bitterness. I had fought to keep her, sacrificed pieces of myself for her, but that chapter was over. It was time to close the book, to walk away from the ashes of a life we'd burned to the ground. I turned to leave, my step steady, feeling lighter than I had in months. As I reached the door, Sophie's voice called out, trembling, desperate. Jack, please don't go. Please. I love you. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, her words hanging in the air. For a brief moment, I almost turned back, almost let her tears pull me in. But I knew better. I knew that going back would only drag us both into a cycle of hurt, of broken promises and empty apologies. Without looking back, I opened the door and stepped outside, closing it gently behind me. The weight of it all lifted as I walked away, my heart bruised but somehow free. I had loved her, and a part of me always would, but I couldn't be with someone who had shattered that love, who had treated our life together as if it were something disposable. As I drove to Emma's, my mind felt clearer, the road stretching out ahead of me like a promise. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I was ready for something new. But I did know one thing, I was done fighting for someone who didn't know how to fight for me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.